Okay, I think we'll get going in that case then. So welcome again, everyone. So I'm Martin. I'm a senior client lead at Humanate, and today I'm joined here by Elle and by Alex. Elle is director at Humanate and an expert in helping brands get close to their consumers and building real consumer closeness and empathy. Alex is a project director at Space Doctors and an expert in helping brands become culturally fluent. So, over the next 45 minutes, we'll explore why empathy has become such a critical capability for brands today. We'll see how it's shaping and, in fact, as we'll see, sometimes derailing brand decisions. And we also see what leading organizations are doing to rebuild this empathy. And throughout, we'll bring that to life via a series of real examples and case studies as well. Little bit of housekeeping before we get fully underway. So throughout the session, feel free to share thoughts or reactions in the chat that you can see on the right-hand side of your screen there. And if you have questions that come up along the way, you can drop them into the Q&A tab at any time at all as well. It's an interactive session, so you also have the option to upvote questions from others that feel most relevant to you. And we'll try and answer as many as we can as we go through, or at the end of the chat, or during the Q&A at the end. And finally, we've also got some emojis you can use as well. So please feel free to use them to react, to agree, or simply show what's resonating as we go along as well. And I can see some thumbs up signs there already, so that's fantastic. Thank you. Amazing. Great. So let's take a moment to set the scene. We can see that quote there on the screen there. We know the empathy gap is widening. That figure there, 78% of consumers believe most companies only care about making money, not their genuine needs, as in not the genuine needs of consumers. And that's a perception that sits under the surface of a lot of brand consumer relationships today. I think consumers accept that companies are there to make money, but probably feel that they could be a bit more consumer centric in doing so as well. And I think one thing that underlines this is that we see this is also happening across Europe. We see that there are shifts in family composition, there are shifts in demographics when it comes to age, there are shifts in identity as well. So let's take these in turn. So first of all, when we look at family realities, if we take the family structure, in 1 in 3 UK households is now a blended or a multi-generational household, and chosen single parenthood is actually rising fast. So people actually, consciously choosing to bring up children in a single parent environment. If we look at age, we see now that nearly 3 million people who had retired are now back in work, and that women over 65 are actually the real drivers of entrepreneurship, with that being the fastest growing group for entrepreneurs. Identity, that's also evolving. We're now at a stage where white British is below 80% of the UK population, and 1 in 5 school children are multilingual. So that really reflects that shift as well. And also when it comes to attraction patterns, Gen Z are showing now that 40% are showing those queer attraction patterns in terms of how they see themselves and their identity. The point to underline here is that that idea of the traditional nuclear family, that sort of normative nuclear family, that's really receding if it ever was a reality. It's not, this is mainstream Britain now, and we see that these realities, whilst they're becoming more prominent, are rarely actually showing up in how brands design products, services, or communications. And when you look at the data, this gap becomes even clearer. So we'll look at one of these groups and hone in on these in particular, and that's older adults, because they're a perfect example of these gaps. So the 50+ population will account for 60% of global spending power by 2050. So that's just one generation away. This is a school of thought and a fact that taps into the content from our 2024 webinar, Silver is the New Gold, and we looked at specifically the 55+ age group and how they were more nuanced than we often give credit to from a marketing perspective. And indeed, silvers are one of the most underserved audiences. They're living longer, they're working longer, and they're driving huge cultural and economic shifts. But as we can see, to many marketers, they're almost invisible. Only 5 to 10% of marketing budgets are focused on reaching them. And that's a miss, because we see actually, and it's a miss from the perspective of these older age groups, 57% of people aged 50 plus say they feel ignored or undervalued by brands. So we have a group that's growing in size, it's growing in influence, and importantly, it's growing in spending power. But paradoxically, from the perspective of marketing, it seems to be shrinking in visibility. And if we want to understand what that really looks like in practice, we need to zoom in a little bit as well, because it's a perception that isn't evenly distributed. Some groups feel it more strongly than others. So let's then have a look at and see who feels seen and who doesn't by taking a quick look at this clip here.
I don't feel like I'm spoken to very often. You know, I watch television, go to the cinema more than anything else now, and I certainly don't see any advertising that's largely aimed at me. I feel it's always aimed at a younger audience, and probably an audience that probably hasn't got as much money as me. And if there is an advert aimed at me, like a cruise advert, it's always some awfully attractive couple walking on a sandy beach dressed in white linen, pointing at a cruise ship. And it's just so stereotypical and so bland and so drab that it washes over me. But they don't advertise to me in a way that excites me in my stage of life either. So.
Great. So I think this clip shows us something simple, but actually really powerful. That feeling that I don't feel like I'm spoken to very often. And it's interesting as well, the gentleman in the clip as well, that self-awareness that his age group has more money to spend and is potentially looking for brands who recognize that and welcome him as a consumer and welcome him as a customer. But it's not purely about Asian demographics. It's about the broader cultural context too. And indeed, we see that same empathy gap when brands misread cultural context in emerging spaces. So let's take a look at a couple of examples here. So if you take the metaverse, so thinking back all the way to 2021, 5 years ago now, and at that time, the excitement around virtual reality and the metaverse, it was everywhere. It was really like a big part of the hype engine at that point. So headsets, virtual worlds, endless possibilities. It really felt like the next big shift in how we'd live, work, and indeed how we'd connect. And for a while, that excitement felt very real. But if we're honest, for many people, that momentum didn't quite last. And well, why was that? Well, it wasn't a technology issue, because despite billions being invested into virtual worlds and the meta universe experience, mass adoption never really followed. It wasn't that it was that companies perhaps didn't fully understand the people they were trying to reach. So for many, the metaverse was an extension of the same risks and exclusions that exist elsewhere online. And many consumers just simply didn't see a meaningful role for the metaverse in their work, in their play, or in their social life. So it's a classic example of following the technological possibilities, but perhaps not seeing how consumers are in terms of the way they live their lives in reality and connecting with what their actual needs might be and how that might serve those needs. But it's not just about innovation. This is something we see happening in communication too. So in recent years, Nike has been running its After Dark tour. This is a series of nighttime runs across different cities positioned for women. The idea of this was to create a space for women runners built around safety, community, and performance. And the intention was really strong. It was there to celebrate running culture. However, what we found was that when the event took place in London specifically, many people were caught off guard by an unexpected sight. And that sight was, well, men being on the start line. And for some, this fundamentally changed the whole kind of vibe and the whole feel of the event. What was anticipated for many to feel like a safe, woman-focused space suddenly felt very different. So let's take a step back and think what went wrong here. Well, for Nike, the event was about inclusion and shared running culture, but with a focus on women. But for many women participants, the emotional meaning of reclaiming the night was very different to one that perhaps Nike had intended and had in mind. For them, it was rooted in the context of women's safety when running after dark. And the presence of men on the start line evoked the feelings of vulnerability and caution they felt the event was specifically designed to avoid. And this is where the gap appears. It's a gap in empathy. It's the gap between how something is designed and how it's actually received by its intended audience and how it's actually experienced in real life. But many brands are failing to adapt to these shifts. And it's a pattern that we at Humanate and Space Doctors, we see it again and again. And that's the heart of the issue. Brands, as mentioned previously, are still designing from their own perspective rather than the lived realities of the people they're necessarily trying to reach. And as a result, that empathy gap just gets more wider and wider. But there's a clear lesson to draw from this. A brand or an entire industry can drift when the consumer is not part of the design. And I think that's the thing to acknowledge, that it's easier than ever to make mistakes. And even the most well-resourced brands can stumble in this respect. And what lies at the heart of this problem, it's not a data problem. Many of our brands have more data than they can possibly potentially process. And it's not necessarily a strategy gap, but it's something that comes down to being much more fundamental and much more human. And as a result, millions of people feel unseen, and it's resulting in a blind spot worth trillions of euros. So on that note, I'll hand over to Alex, who will dive deeper into what we understand by empathy and how we see it evolving.
Amazing. Thank you, Martin. So yeah, empathy isn't new. It's ancient. It's how humans have always survived and thrived together. Before systems or institutions, empathy was how we decided who do I trust, who do I protect, and where do I belong. It's this kind of invisible infrastructure of every community. And today, empathy is still the mechanism behind trust, intimacy, and understanding. It's how we interpret not just what people say, but why and how they say it. It's also how we find meaning in our own lives through relationships, not just achievements. But today, something that we'll talk about is this capacity being under pressure. And across society, there are these kind of growing signals that people really feel less heard, understood, and seen. At Space Doctors, we are the cultural fluency agency within Humanate. We always kind of start our analysis from a cultural point of view. And that helps us to understand the wider forces that are impacting consumer behavior and how that might change in the future, often before consumers are able to articulate that for themselves. So from our team of cultural experts who work on global projects across lots of different categories, our analysis into empathy found that there is a clear tension showing up here. And that is the tension between empathy fatigue and empathy deficit. So let's look at those in a little bit more detail. On the one hand, we have this idea of empathy fatigue. So think about how your day starts. You might open your phone or your laptop, and immediately you're probably bombarded with information. In fact, the average person receives more than 150 notifications every day. And I'm sure a lot of the people on this call receive a lot more than that. So from social media apps to work emails to group chats, one after the other, we're exposed to lots of different messaging. And sometimes that can be quite distressing. War, the climate crisis, social injustice, it's all in our pockets and at our fingertips all the time. So dopamine and cortisol are kind of constantly spiking. And over time, the capacity to empathize is exhausted. It just becomes too much. And this fatigue turns into numbness. The brain protects itself by starting to avoid or ignore these emotions that are causing us distress on others' behalf. So people are really tuning out. And around 40% say that they actively avoid the news because it feels too emotionally draining. We're seeing a cultural shift back towards kind of analog means of communication and consumption to avoid this. Not because people don't care, but because they simply can't carry it all. The second force at play is the empathy deficit. So in a fast-paced digital world, we're interacting more than ever, but often more superficially. So we live these individualized transactional lives. We're very connected, but not necessarily close. And it's very difficult to pause and understand the depth and the complexity of other people's perspectives, especially in the context of algorithms that reward short, sharp video clips and kind of clickbait headlines that flatten people's experiences. And over time, that weakens our ability to relate to each other. And the result is fragmentation, less tangible community, and less nuanced understanding. And we see this play out in many ways, such as the way that people are dating. There are endless profiles, and we take just a few seconds per decision, seeing people at that real surface level before swiping left or swiping right. As one Gen Z research participant told us, we're just kind of throwing out lines, and this diminishes the value of being in a good relationship. And culturally, we see a resurgence in real life dating events and meetups, often combining interests like running or reading in order to connect on a deeper level. Online motherhood community Peanut expressed how AI can play into the empathy deficit. This campaign from Peanut really highlights the problem with understanding challenges for mothers from a surface level. When experiences are aggregated and averaged based on data alone, without understanding depth, context, or the complexities that exist around them. So while those large language models can learn from women's experiences, AI can never truly embody the experience of being pregnant, giving birth, and caring for a baby. So this sense of synthetic empathy that AI chats can create feels especially jarring. And Peanut's campaign here really highlights how empathy for the realities of motherhood and birth can't be engineered and must be experienced, encouraging women to ask other mothers in the community for truly empathetic advice rather than just AI chats. So you can see how this tension continues to pull in different directions. On one side, we feel too much to keep connecting. And on the other hand, we don't connect deeply enough. And together, these forces create a distance between people and also between brands that are trying to serve them. At Space Doctors, we often say that understanding consumers without understanding culture is like trying to understand fish without understanding the ocean. And having empathy is obviously a huge element of that. Left unaddressed, this tension creates a risk for brands. At the exact moment that people need to feel understood, they are also the least willing to give their attention or emotional energy away, which means that empathy can no longer be assumed. It has to be actively earned through a much deeper, more grounded understanding of people's lived realities. The challenge and the opportunity is this. If you're not continuously getting closer to culture, to context, and to the nuance of how people are actually feeling, you're not just missing insight and opportunity, you're losing relevance. So I'll now pass over to Elle to take us through some further examples and really important provocations.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Alex. So let's make this really concrete now. When was the last time that you truly connected with a real consumer, not through a dashboard or a report, but really in their world, seeing what they see, feeling what they feel, with that real intention to build empathy? We'd love you guys to share your experiences, if indeed you do have any, in the chat as we go there. But for most organizations, that moment is rare. Research shows that at best, it's twice a year. And we all know that people suffer from social desirability when it comes to surveys. So if we're really honest with ourselves, it's probably even less. We are increasingly fragmented and separated. And AI has only made this more apparent. It's given us the illusion that we know everything, but in fact, We understand nothing. We're flooded with data. We have dashboards, segmentation, behavioral tracking, but that data is often disjointed. It's highly rational and it's stripped from context. So do you really know your consumer? Not what they click, but how they live, what they feel, and what's really driving their decisions. And for many organizations, that deeper understanding is still missing. And you can't rely on your own experience to bridge that gap either, because it's simple truth. You are not your consumer. Yes, you might think that your consumers live a little bit like you do, but in reality, many do live very different lives. And the more distance that there is, the easier it becomes to get things wrong. Adland is an Island is a renowned marketing essay that some of you may or may not have read by Alex Murrell. It argues that advertising professionals live in a really disconnected bubble, holding vastly different demographics, personalities, and media habits than the mainstream audiences that they're attempting to sway. Written a few years ago now, this argument continues to stand up. In 2025, the Advertising Association found that only 19% of ad agency workers are working class versus 40% nationally. Perhaps most striking of all, Murrell revealed in his article that 92% of media agency employees voted Remain in the 2016 EU referendum, compared with 48% of the active electorate. And that's exactly why market research exists, right? To bridge that gap, to bring decision makers closer to the people that they serve and the culture that they move in. But let's be honest for a moment. How close does it really bring you? Because today, as we've discussed, most organizations don't lack data. You've done the research. You have the segmentation, the personas. You know what people do. You know what they click and what they buy. You're surrounded by this information and this data. But instead of bringing you closer, it can actually keep you at a distance. You're super data rich, but often still searching for the real foundational understanding of people and the culture that they move in. And even when you do have these insights, the question becomes, is that enough? The short answer is no, it isn't, because insights absolutely can inform, but empathy can translate. Without empathy, data stays abstract, easy to analyze, but also easy to ignore. Empathy makes it real, it makes you feel it, and that's what creates that urgency, that motivation for people to act and what can spark new ideas. Ultimately, empathy inspires action. And this is not just a soft idea. The impact is measurable. Brands that systemically cultivate empathy see measurable returns. They're 60% more profitable, they grow 1.4 times faster, and they realize 1.6 times higher customer lifetime value. Here's the good news in all of this. Empathy isn't fixed. Social neuroscientist Professor Jamil Zaki shows us that we can train our empathy muscles. It is a skill that we can all build, we can strengthen it, and we can scale it. And that means that the thing that might be under pressure today can become a real strategic advantage for you tomorrow. And if empathy is that strategic advantage that we all want, how does it actually take roots inside an organization? Well, the organizations that succeed don't just implement empathy overnight. They build it layer by layer until it becomes part of how decisions are made every day. It starts small and then it grows. And now back over to Martin, who's going to share a couple of examples about how you can start to do that.
Thank you, Elle. Yes, and exactly, I think that's that growth that's important. It's very helpful to think of this as a step-by-step process, and it starts from developing capability at an individual level to embedding empathy deep into the fabric of your organizational culture. So let's start with step one, and it starts with skills. So before empathy can grow into organizations, brands need to invest in the basics first. You have to empower people by building the right skill sets. So in that sense, empathy starts at the individual level. People need to learn how to truly listen and how to move beyond surface observations and how to translate what they hear into meaningful insight and action. And we see as well, like while data literacy has scaled rapidly, empathy literacy perhaps has not. Many teams are trained to analyze, but we can ask ourselves a question if they're trained to truly understand. So taking a client example here, Reckitt approached us as they sensed a need to train that understanding. They had the aim of humanizing consumer insights and increasing their actionability. So what we did was we created a global training program. We educated the team on the importance of consumer centricity, first of all, so they really bought into the principle behind what we were trying to do, and then moving into the practice of immersing them into the consumer's world. We showed them, first of all, what makes a good insight, and then from there, how we can develop some fresh insights from real consumer stories based in their own brands and grounded in their own context. And what's great was that as we went along the way, we noticed something changed, and we noticed that things started to really move. Our insights became less abstract, they became more nuanced, they felt more real, and they became a gateway to recognizable human stories that sat behind the data points. And with this, we help the team build confidence in their ability to turn understanding into action through repeated practice and experience. And moving on to our second step, so spreading through the organization. What we found is that empathy only really creates impact when it does travel through the organization. And that might sound obvious, but what we do see is that in many organizations, insights remain static. They stay captured in decks, they remain stored in platforms, they're consumed only by a few stakeholders. And when that happens, what we find is that empathy, of course, stays siloed. And organizations, however, that embed empathy differently can make insights travel. It's not more information, but it becomes a question of more connection. So what does that look like? Well, it can take many forms. So for example, if you want to reach large groups, formats like posters or infographics or newsletters and playbooks work really effectively. If it's a question of workshops, interactive tools such as board games or AI avatars really bring to life consumer segments, and they can foster that deeper understanding. If it's a question of executive meetings, it's engaging video stories that have that sort of really punchy element that can capture attention and bring the consumer to life in a very simple but effective way. But of course, then we can take this further with, for example, immersive experiences that extend the impact and the memory of insights. And it's these created, tailored formats that can really accelerate the flow of insights across the organization, because they're created with a clear intent and with the audience in mind. So it's adapted to who you're trying to reach, how you're trying to reach them, and what you're trying to achieve with that as well. And that's so important for making that insight and that connection really travel. And it's something that we do ourselves when we work with Coca-Cola in the US. So as a strategic partner to them, we help them transform complex research and other data sources into stories, visuals, and experiences tailored by audience. And as a result, that insight, well, it starts to travel and it starts to actively shape conversations. It can inspire teams and it can strengthen partner collaborations as well. So let's look at a really nice little specific example of this, and let's see this brought to life. We recently hosted an educational seminar at CinemaCon, the world's largest gathering of cinema owners. And what we did there was we created a compelling narrative that combined consumer research, cultural trends, and business opportunities. So with that, we provided practical strategies for cinema owners to drive traffic with Gen Z moviegoers. And it was really a win-win. It helped not only to showcase Coca-Cola's deep expertise and strong partnership within the industry, but for cinema owners, it really helped them to bridge the gap between themselves and their audiences. Right, so at this stage, we're halfway through our step-by-step journey, and Elle is going to jump in again now and take you through steps 3 and 4.
Lovely, thank you, Martin. So, thirdly, empathy deepens through experience. Understanding people from a distance is not the same as experiencing their reality. Empathy becomes even more powerful when teams step into the worlds of the people that they serve, seeing their environments, observing their habits, and hearing those stories firsthand. So to return to Alex's previous point, think of it like that fish in the ocean. Investigating the fish tells us all about the consumer. Investigating the ocean tells us about culture. Both are essential. Cultural immersion can uncover the broader currents that are shaping behaviour, while consumer immersion reveals the lived reality of those daily choices. These immersive moments make consumers harder to stereotype, harder to reduce to a data point. They add lots of texture, nuance, and context. And this is where empathy moves from something quite abstract to something really embodied. It's where those more meaningful ideas begin to emerge. So to bring fresh shopper insights and inspiration to the marketing team at Samsung, Samsung Home Electronics in the US initiated an inspirational retail safari in New York, followed by a digital safari for the same brands. We started with quite a stark business challenge: how to make the Samsung retail experience, for want of a better word, more experiential. So we needed inspiration. Samsung teams were tasked with experiencing some out-of-category retail locations as shoppers. A digital safari exercise for the same brands was also completed by cross-functional team members to really explore how the online and the in-store can be integrated. As part of this safari, the team collected over 250 observations, fueled to create some really exciting, empathetic experiences. We mapped those observations in a workshop, all onto an experience framework, and discussed through the implications for these. By stepping into the shoes of consumers and experiencing those different retail environments completely from a consumer perspective, the teams ended up with 80 plus ideas to improve the Samsung Home Electronics retail experience, and presented those best ideas in a Dragon's Den style pitch. But empathy isn't just for our client-facing teams, perhaps like marketing and sales there. On the contrary, it's equally or even more important perhaps for teams further away from consumers, such as R&D, digital teams, and leadership. And that's something that Haleon, the world leader in consumer health, keeps really close to their heart. The brand connected R&D and innovation teams directly with consumers and healthcare professionals to deepen their understanding and really, again, fuel that consumer-centric innovation. We trained Haleon employees to confidently lead sessions and get the most out of the time that they were spending with consumers and healthcare experts. The Haleon team also ensured that this investment in empathy drove impact. They came together to share their key learnings, their aha moments, during a workshop reflection session, leveraging those insights to drive innovation. By capturing those consumer and those expert stories, the Haleon R&D team were able to really build empathy, really get in touch with the emotions of real people, and therefore were able to provide insight springboards for future ideations. And that takes us on to our fourth point, that over time, empathy really starts to shape everyday decisions. As empathy really deepens within your organization, it starts to influence how decisions are made. Teams begin to ask different questions. They challenge assumptions more actively, and they consider not just what works, but what resonates. Empathy shifts from being something that you apply occasionally to something that quietly guides everyday thinking across functions, teams, and levels of seniority. At its most mature, empathy doesn't any longer depend on individual effort or isolated initiatives. It's sustained more structurally through programs, rituals, and ways of working that help reinforce that over time. It becomes embedded in workflows, it's built into processes, and it's supported by leadership. And that way, empathy really becomes part of your organization's DNA. It's not something anymore that you need to activate. It's simply how your organization operates. And that is exactly what happened when L'Oreal, a company with strong heritage in consumer centricity, introduced Beauty Talks, a global consumer connect program. Way back in 2020, the beauty giant felt the need to really level up their game and move from consumer understanding to really having that consumer empathy in response to the really incredibly dynamic and ever-changing beauty categories that they are operating within. I want to share with you now a short promo video that we created to introduce this empathy program to the global stakeholder group at L'Oreal. So as you could super clearly see there, by keeping that constant finger on the pulse, the continuous sensing, and really embedding empathy in business processes and decision making, it really can become a strategic advantage over time. Stakeholders really start to see the value and the impact of these collective efforts. As you can see here, with a score of 8.5 out of 10 coming from the most recent Beauty Talks Impact Survey, we can say that L'Oreal teams across the globe recognize consumer empathy now as instrumental to their brand growth. And although we do leverage tech and AI to scale and socialize empathy at L'Oreal, the power of the program lies in putting stakeholders in direct contact with different audiences. Whether, as you saw, that's through a series of online connects as part of the development process, or during offline strategy days, as you can see here on the screen. It's in that human-to-human connection. That's where the magic happens, and that's when things start to move. It's through collecting and sharing those human stories that we don't only energize stakeholders around topics and audiences, but we also drive action. And with that, I'm going to hand back over to Martin to give us a little bit of a wrap up now.
Thanks, Elle. Yeah, so I think if there's one thing to take away from everything you've heard from us so far, it's this, and it's the quote you can see on the slide here. It's that to move people with your brand, you have to be moved by them first. And I think there's a profundity in that it's not just being taken by their data, but it's by their reality, their emotions, and their everyday lives. So there's a great example of this done well as well. So taking us back to the top of our presentation, where we highlighted the shift away from the assumed norm of the nuclear family, EE, a British mobile network operator and internet service provider, created a seasonal campaign inspired by the fact that 27% of Brits will do the Christmas double. So what do we mean by this? Well, it's a great example of what happens when brands stay close to real life. What we see in the ad is that it reflects the reality of modern families, more complex, more blended, not always perfect. And concretely, this is a fact that many people in the UK need to be in 2 or more different locations on Christmas Day if they want to celebrate with their entire family. And really, I think that's exactly why it resonates. For many people, well, for 27% of people, in fact, it feels familiar, honest, and culturally in tune. And that's really empathy in action. What's great about that, I think, is that you might, from some quant data, you might see the fact that people are celebrating Christmas this way, but without actually speaking to those consumers, you wouldn't necessarily know what that looks like or how that feels. And you can see here in the way this ad is executed, you can see that feeling, and you can really see that reality as well. So it's turning everyday reality into something people generally recognize themselves in. You can see the ad playing in the background. We won't play the whole of it, but I think what I'd encourage you to do is, if you haven't seen it, do go away, do go and find it online and give it a watch. It's fantastic, and there's a great payoff at the end, which really reflects everything I've just mentioned there about what they recognize about family realities. So we started by highlighting the 78% of people who feel brands prioritize making money over the needs of consumers. From that very same study, 73% of people said they would avoid businesses that don't show empathy. And almost half of those would take their business elsewhere if brands fail to deliver. So we're not just talking really about missing an opportunity, it's about actively discouraging people from your brand. So it can be quite stark if we don't get this right. And we know there's a gap between brand teams and consumers in terms of social demographics, attitudes, and behaviors. And that gap can lead to poor outcomes and sometimes misfiring strategies as well. But as we've spoken about today, getting close to consumers, making connections with consumers, building empathy with consumers, all this can be achieved through the 4 steps we've taken you through. So those steps, it's developing skills, it's spreading those skills through the organization, it's deepening the capability through experience, and then it's embedding what is learned into everyday decision making. And with that, we can truly begin to feel the empathy effect and to close the empathy gap. So that's it for the content we had to deliver you today. So before we jump into your questions, we'd also really appreciate a bit of feedback. You can see appear on the screen now a QR code. If you have your phone handy, we'd really appreciate it if you could scan it and answer 3 short questions. And should everything go well, you should be able to see a pop-up window with a survey link appear on the screen. And please, yeah, your feedback generally helps us improve these sessions and shape future editions. So really do appreciate that. And yeah, thank you in advance for taking the time to do that as well. So
amazing. Let's jump into the Q&As. There's a couple of questions that have come in, but feel free to keep them coming as we discuss. And maybe I'll come to you, Elle, first for this one. A question's come in: what happens when empathy exists but it gets overruled? In most businesses, someone in the team or in the room knew that the campaign was wrong, or the customer wasn't truly reflected. What does it take to make sure that voice gets heard?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Alex, and thanks, Jane, for that question. I think this one is all about those types of things that you can bring to the room beyond the data. So when we talked about having all of this data that we can bring up, and it starts to prove those business cases, and that's where you get into somebody making one of these decisions that perhaps someone's sitting there going, no, this isn't my consumer. That's where it's all about bringing consumers into the room, whether it's through some really impactful video clips, whether it's through some kind of really impactful ethno films that you may have, something where you can really bring that consumer to life. I've personally been in some live debriefs where we had some architects, interestingly, in that debrief that they'd never seen beyond the data. They'd just not been in that environment before, and it was the first time that anyone had brought to them those video clips of actual customers talking and explain their experience in this particular context. And it was so insightful for them, and it helped them to kind of move beyond that this is the decision we're going to make based on just the data, without thinking about that real human impact as well. So all about the types of things that you bring to the room, I think, to help give you that support. I don't know if, Martin, you had anything to add?
Yeah, no, I'd totally agree with that, Elle. And I think as well that sometimes if you're in an isolated situation where something gets overruled, that can happen. But I think what's important there as well is bringing those things into the room, but it's doing it consistently as well. So it's building that culture over time, so that when you get into these situations where there is that debate, that you have the grounding in that culture of empathy that makes that argument easier to win, because you've got an organization that's attuned to that and attuned to the importance of it as well.
Nice. I know we're kind of almost at time, but maybe just one more question. What about when organizations, like lots of us are under loads of pressure to be more efficient and more data driven? And maybe, Martin, we could come to you first for this one. How do you build a business case for investing in empathy and consumer closeness?
Yeah, I think that the beauty of empathy programs is that they're scalable. So in building a business case, the great thing about it is that you can start small. So you can actually create a bit of a proof of concept first of all. Often we start with a pilot phase when we build empathy programs. So we start perhaps with like maybe just a few connects, maybe like a single empathy event with a select group of stakeholders, to start to get that buzz and that excitement, almost that exclusivity sometimes as well, that, you know, it's a chosen group in the organization who get to experience this first, and then perhaps become kind of people who then will talk about it in the organization, talk about the experience they had and recommending it to others. And you can build it out from there as well. And you can build it out across different categories. You can build it out across different markets. You can build it out across different stakeholder groups as well. So there is that opportunity to build small and then build bigger as well. And I think there was a question in the chat about the L'Oreal project and how that started and how the impact was felt. It's important to say that L'Oreal is probably one of our biggest projects we do from an empathy perspective, but that started with a pilot as well. And that started small and that built over time.
Do you have any further thoughts on that one, Elle?
I think, yes, absolutely echoing what Martin said, but then Sometimes also finding where we can potentially slot into existing meetings, days that you guys may already have organised with certain groups of stakeholders, groups of leadership. That's often a really nice way to, again, start small, bring some of that empathy into the room, where you may already have something organised and you can workshop around these things. It can be a really nice place to initially inject things like live connects or bringing some of those videos or even safaris into that experience.
Amazing. So I think that's probably all we've got time for today, but we'll follow up with any other questions that people might have had in the chat. But thank you so much for joining. You'll receive a recording of this after the session, but do feel free to reach out to any of us on email if you have any other specific questions.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thanks all.